The Path is a teaching series sponsored by World Missionary Evangelism. We hope that this series will deepen your knowledge and walk in our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's your host, John Cathcart.
We're talking about Paul, two Pauls. The one that we think of as being aggressive, heroic, fearless, and then the inner Paul. You know, in the movie Patton, there's a great scene when General George Patton comes on the scene and the Germans realize they're going to have to fight him. And one of the German generals says to his intelligence agent, "Tell me about Patton." And the intelligence agent says, well, he's the wealthiest officer in the American Army, and he went to this school, and he did this, and he did that. And the German general says to his intelligence officer, "No, I don't want to know those kind of facts. Tell me about the man. Tell me about the way the man really is." And so you have to go not to the historical record, but to the letters of Paul to get an insight. It's not from the book of Acts that you get an insight from Luke into what Paul is really like, but it's from Paul's own writings. And sometimes in his writing, his heart beats with such quick emotion, and his thoughts rush with such confused impetuosity that in disconnected statement after disconnected statement and parentheses after parentheses, the whole meaning of what he's saying becomes somewhat uncertain. And his feeling is so intense that his very words catch a life of their own. They seem to become, quote, living creatures with hands and feet, unquote. And sometimes he's almost contemptuous in his assertion of the rectitude which makes him indifferent to vulgar criticism, and keenly bitter in the sarcasm of his self-deprecation. Now, in one or two instances, an enemy might also apply the word brutal. And some of the language of Paul is brutal, in which he ridicules or denounces or unmasks those who put down his gospel. And in one or two speeches, he speaks with a tinge of irony, almost of irritation, about those who are accounted to be pillars, the out-and-out apostles. I mean, he's talking about the top apostles, who even if they were apostles 10 times over, added nothing to him. But Paul has no sooner said some of these outrageous things than the storm of passion dies away in a moment. And he's sorry even for the most necessary and justly deserved severity. And Paul winds up in expressions of tenderness and, as it were, with a burst of tears. Now, it is true that we recognize in Saul of Tarsus, that's the first Saul, that's Saul the persecutor. We recognize the restlessness, the vehemence, the impetuous eagerness which we see in Paul the Apostle. But it's hard to imagine in Saul of Tarsus the nervous, shrinking, tremulous sensibility, profound distrust of his own gifts and power, apart from divine grace, which is so repeatedly manifest in the language of Paul, who is the fettered captive of Jesus Christ. And it's hard to imagine that such a man as the apostle became, or ever could have become, the furious inquisitor, the intruder even into the sacred retirement of a peaceful home, the eager candidate for the power to suppress a heresy even in distant cities, which Saul was before the vision on his way to Damascus. Now, the Lord has a way of humbling us. And when you come to know the Lord, he takes you down a peg or two. He will definitely take you down. I have seen people seeking the Holy Spirit who said they would receive the Holy Spirit, but they wouldn't speak in tongues. Generally, those were the people that spoke in tongues for several days. And never say to the Lord, I won't do this or I won't do that. Believe me, the Lord can take you down a peg or two, and many of us need to be taken down a peg or two, and Paul had been such a man. Now, it's a matter of common experience that some physical humiliation, even if it takes the form of a terrible disfigurement, often acts in this very way upon human character. It makes the bold shrink, makes the arrogant humble, makes the self-confident timid. It makes those who once loved publicity to long to hide themselves in the crowd, and it turns every thought from trust in self to humblest submission to the will of God. And even a dangerous illness is sometimes sufficient to produce results like these. But when the illness leaves its physical marks for the rest of their life upon the frame, its effects are intensified. And it was experiences such as this that changed a mirthful party-goer and reveler like St. Francis of Assisi into a squalid ascetic, and a favorite, a playboy of society like Francis Xavier into a toilsome missionary, and a happy-go-lucky, flamboyant gay soldier like Ignatius Loyola into a rigid devotee. Well, what the nature of this stake in the flesh was, we can consider in more depth later. But whatever it may have been, it came to Paul as a direct consequence of visions and revelations, and as a direct counteraction to the inflation and self-importance which such exceptional insight might otherwise have caused a character such as his to be elevated and blown up. And we are therefore naturally to suppose that the first impalement of health by this wounding splinter accompanied and resulted from the greatest of all his revelations, the appearance to him of the risen Christ as he was traveling at noonday nigh to Damascus.
World Missionary Evangelism, through its wide variety of mission outreach programs, is an evangelical force in developing nations, and it all begins with native missionaries. Called by Christ to do his work, our native missionaries are first and foremost soul winners. Often facing hostile opposition, they have the courage to reach out in compassion to the lost, sharing the good news with those in their communities. But that is just the beginning of WME's evangelistic programs. World Missionary Evangelism reaches children through vacation Bible schools and Christian schools. So even as we feed the hungry bodies of little ones, we also feed their souls. For almost 6 decades, WME has been building churches in both urban and rural areas. Most of these churches are used every day of the week and become beacons of light in the areas where they serve. Churches not only provide worship opportunities, but they also offer a community gathering point, education, childcare, and even serve as feeding centers for the hungry. WME not only sponsors native missionaries, we train them. World Missionary Evangelism has local pastoral education programs for new missionaries and continuing education programs for those who have been in the field for years. WME also has Bible colleges that provide degree programs for those seeking a fuller knowledge of the Bible and Christian outreach. The evangelism in World Missionary Evangelism is not just a part of our name. It defines our mission, our focus, and is at the heart of everything we do.
Well, calmed by retirement, and it may be calmed by fresh revelations of the will of God, we don't know. But certainly clearer in his conceptions of truth and duty, Saul returned to Damascus from Arabia. And we don't need to look for any further motives of his return than such as arose from the conviction that he was now sufficiently prepared to do the work to which Christ himself had called him. Well, Paul did not at once begin his mission to the Gentiles. To the Jew first was the understood rule of early apostolic teaching. And indeed, it had been involved in the directions given by Christ himself. Jesus said, "You shall be witnesses unto me in China." No, he didn't say that. "You'll be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem, and then in Judea, and then in the uttermost parts of the world." The Gentiles were so unfamiliar, incidentally, with the institution of preaching. Preaching was something the Gentiles didn't know about. Their whole idea of worship was so alien from every form of doctrinal and moral exhortation that to begin by preaching to them was almost impossible. And even though preaching was an alien form of worship to Gentiles, this may surprise us as Christians who go to church. And we're used to preaching. It doesn't bother us one bit. Sometimes we don't even listen. I had a sister-in-law who went to a Presbyterian church, and she told me she just sat there and admired the rose window, the stained glass window. She never listened to what was being said. And though preaching was an alien form of worship to Gentiles, it was through the Jews. This is ironic, but it was through the Jews the Gentiles were most easily reached. Now, this may sound like a paradox, but it's true. The proselytes, numerous in every city, were especially numerous in Damascus. And by their agency, it was certain that every truth propounded in Jewish synagogues would, even if only by the agency of the female proselytes, be rapidly communicated to the Gentile agora. And so it was therefore to the synagogues that Paul naturally resorted, and there that he first began to deliver his message. Well, since the Christians at this time were still in communion with the synagogues and the temple, and since their leader in Damascus, Ananias, was so devout according to the law as to won the willing testimony of all Jews who lived in Damascus, no obstacle would be placed in the way of the youthful rabbi, Paul. And as he had been a scholar of the most eminent of the Jewish schools and a student of Gamaliel, his earliest appearances on the arena of controversy would be awaited with attention and curiosity. Here's the man that has been killing Christians, and now he's become a Christian. Naturally, everyone wants to hear him. And we have no reason to suppose that the opposition and animosity toward the Nazarenes, which Saul himself had kept alive in Jerusalem, had penetrated to Damascus. You know, we forget how recently international communication has become instantaneously. This is only a very recent thing. News was very slow to travel in Eastern countries. And the instantaneous waves of information, and much of it correct and much of it incorrect, which flood modern civilization, were not known in ancient times. Now, in the capital of Syria, Jews and Christians were still living together in mutual toleration, if not in mutual esteem. And they had lived this way in Jerusalem until, and this is interesting, Christians and Jews had gotten along in Jerusalem following the death of Christ until the spark of hatred had been struck by the collision of the Hellenists of the liberal school with the legalists of the narrow school. It was the collision of Jewish liberals, liberal in their theology, let's say prophetic. Those Jews who were more prophetic in their view than those who were very legalistic in their views. Well, to Paul, if not totally, yet in great measure, this collision had been due. Paul is the one who caused this collision. And Saul, well, Paul had been on his way to stir up the same wrath and strife in Damascus when he had been resistlessly arrested on his unhallowed mission by the vision and the approach of the ascended Lord. But the authority and the letters from the high priest in Jerusalem had been entrusted to Paul alone, and none but a few hot zealots really desired that pious and respectable persons like Ananias, children of Abraham and servants of Moses, should be dragged with a halter around their necks from peaceful homes, scourged by the people with whom they had lived without any serious disagreement, and hailed to Jerusalem by fanatics who would do their best to procure against them the fatal vote which might consign them to revolting horrors of an almost obsolete execution, namely stoning. So that each ruler of the synagogue over whom Paul might have been domineering, with all the superior pride of learning and all the intemperance of flaming zeal, now the leaders of the synagogue might be glad to see and hear a man who could no longer hold in terror over them the commission of the Sanhedrin. This was different.
World missionary evangelism began when John E. Douglas Sr. accepted the challenge of caring for 6 orphan children in India. From this act of love sprang a work that has grown to include children's homes, schools, leper clinics, vocational and agricultural education, disaster relief, feeding programs, drilling water wells, and building churches. And at the heart of all of WME's work has been living out the Great Commission to take the news of salvation through Jesus to everyone we meet. World Missionary Evangelism's work has grown from the initial effort to save 6 children in India to establishing mission projects across the globe. If you would prefer to mail in your gift, send it to WME, Post Office Box 660800. That's 660800, Dallas, Texas 75266.
Paul has returned from Arabia, most likely Sinai, to Damascus, and speaking in Jewish synagogues is still open to him. And in fact, he was welcomed because he was a curiosity. And the synagogues wanted to see and hear this man who had been such a terrible persecutor of Christians and now had become one himself. Now, had Paul proved to be just an ordinary disputant, the placidity of Jewish self-esteem would not have been disturbed, nor would he have ruffled the sluggish stream of legal self-satisfaction. Paul did not speak of circumcision as being superfluous. We might think he did. He did later, but not now. And he didn't say anything about the evanescence of temple service or the substitution of a more spiritual worship for a legalistic ceremonial version. He did not breathe a word about turning to the Gentiles, even though the Lord had called him to do that. The subject of Paul's preaching at this time was simply this, that Jesus was the Son of God. That was the sum of it. And at first, this preaching excited no special indignation. The worshippers in the synagogue only felt a keen astonishment that this was the man who had ravaged in Jerusalem all those that called on, quote unquote, this name, and the man who had come to Damascus for the express purpose of leading believers in Jesus bound to the high priest. But you know, once self-love is seriously wounded, toleration rarely survives. And this was the case with the Jews of Damascus. And they very soon discovered that it was no Ananias with whom they had to deal. It was throughout life Paul's unhappy fate to kindle the most virulent animosities, because though conciliatory and courteous by temperament, yet he carried into his arguments that intensity and forthrightness which awaken dormant opposition. Now, a languid controversialist will always meet with languid tolerance. But any controversialist whose honest belief in his own doctrines makes him terribly in earnest may count for sure on a life embittered by the anger of those on whom he has forced the disagreeable task of reconsidering their own assumptions. Nobody likes to be suddenly awakened, and the Jews were indignant with one who had disturbed the deep slumber of their decided opinions. And furthermore, their accredited teachers did not like to be deposed from the papacy of infallible ignorance. And they began at Damascus to feel towards Saul that fierce detestation which dogged him thenceforth to the last day of his life. And the horrible thing was that out of their own scriptures, by their own methods of exegesis, in their own style of dialectics, by the interpretation of prophecies of which they did not dispute the truth, he simply confounded them. And he would now apply the very same principles which, in the mouth of Stephen, he had found it impossible to resist. And the result was an unanswerable proof that the last eon of God's earthly dispensations had now dawned, that all things had passed away and all things had become new. Well, if arguments are such that they cannot be refuted, and yet those who hear them will not yield to them, the outcome is a bitter rage. And it was so with the Jews. Now, some time had now elapsed since Saul's return from Arabia, and unfortunately, the Jews in Damascus saw no immediate chance of getting rid of this dangerous intruder. And they therefore took refuge in what the famous St. Chrysostom, the golden mouth they called him, calls, quote, the syllogism of violence. It's amazing I think of Oliver Goldsmith and the great philosopher. And they were discussing one day something, and the great philosopher said something that Oliver Goldsmith couldn't agree with. And Goldsmith said, well, how can you resist this argument? And the great philosopher took his walking cane and slammed a lamppost. They were in London, and said, I resist it thus. And so when people can't resist something logically, very frequently they resort to violence. Well, they might at least plead the excuse. And how bitter was the remorse with which such a plea would excite in Paul's unconscious. They might plead that they were only treating Paul in the way in which he himself had treated all who had had the same opinions. Now, even-handed justice was thus commending to his own lips the ingredients of that poisoned chalice of intolerance which he, Paul himself, had forced on others. And it is far from improbable that it was at this early period that the apostle endured one, and perhaps more than one, of those 5 Jewish scourgings or beatings with rods which he tells the Corinthians he had suffered at the hands of the Jews. St. Luke doesn't tell us this, but Paul said 5 times he received 39 stripes from the Jews, and probably it was at Damascus at this time.
Many people are shocked when they discover that world missionary evangelism has been building, funding, and staffing Bible colleges for decades. These institutions of learning offer those called to preach the gospel and share the good news an educational foundation to better serve God and man. In the courses taught by experienced instructors, students grow in biblical faith and knowledge, as well as in all facets of mission outreach and work. The tools provided by these colleges help build roads of understanding that enable our sponsored missionaries to reach countless souls. Bible colleges, therefore, are just another example of the fact that the evangelism and world missionary evangelism is not just part of the name. It defines our mission, our focus, and is the heart of our work.